The sky over Germany on October 14th, 1943, was a maelstrom of fire, steel, and vapor trails. For the crew of a B-17 Flying Fortress, the world was reduced to a vibrating aluminum tube filled with the deafening roar of engines and the rhythmic chatter of 50-caliber machine guns. One moment, Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith was fighting for his life against swarms of Luftwaffe fighters. The next, a percussive blast tore through the fuselage, replacing the roar with a terrifying scream of wind and the sudden gut-wrenching lurch of a fatal dive. The jump order was a formality. The sky that had been his battlefield became his escape, a brief, silent fall under a canopy of silk before the hard, unforgiving soil of enemy territory rose up to meet him. Capture was swift. The transition from warrior to prisoner was a jarring psychological whiplash. The adrenaline of combat evaporated, replaced by the cold, quiet dread of the unknown. The world shrank from the vast European theatre of operations to the confines of a barbed wire fence. This is the story of not just survival, but of a quiet, profound war fought after the battle was lost. It is a story that proves that in the desolate calculus of captivity, the will to resist is not always fueled by grand strategy or daring escapes, but by the unexpected, transformative power of a simple cardboard box. This is about how the Red Cross Parcel became far more than charity. It was a standardized, mass-produced weapon against despair, a tool of economic warfare within the camps, and the most tangible proof a forgotten man could hold that the world beyond the wire had not, in fact, forgotten him. The initial hours and days of captivity were a systematic dismantling of a soldier's identity. He was stripped of his weapons, his equipment, and his name, which was replaced by a number on a dog tag and a file in a German administrative office. The experience was described with chilling clarity by Alex Lees, a British soldier captured in North Africa, whose diary entries chronicle this descent. One felt as if a curtain had come down, cutting one off from all that had been normal life, he wrote. The future was a blank, a void filled with uncertainty and a gnawing anxiety. This was not the sharp, immediate fear of combat, but a slow, corrosive acid of hopelessness. The routine of the camp was designed to enforce submission through monotony, the endless appel, or roll call, in the pre-dawn chill, the meagre rations of black bread and turnip soup, the constant presence of armed guards and watchtowers, all worked to grind down the individual spirit. Lees observed the subtle changes in his fellow prisoners. Men who had been NCOs and leaders in their units became withdrawn, their eyes vacant. The loss of purpose was as debilitating as the hunger. In the outside world, their lives had been measured by objectives taken, missions flown, and the camaraderie of their unit. Inside the wire, life was measured by the passage of time, marked only by the changing of the guards and the pangs of an empty stomach. The psychological shock was profound. It was the realization that your fate was no longer in your own hands. For officers, this shock was compounded by the burden of command. Lieutenant General Albert P. Clark, one of the highest-ranking American officers to be captured and held in Stalag Luft III, documented this struggle in his memoirs. While the enlisted man contended with his personal despair, officers like Clark were immediately confronted with the challenge of holding a command structure together in a state of institutionalized powerlessness. Their first duty was to their men, but they had no weapons, no resources, and no authority recognized by their captors beyond the articles of the Geneva Convention. Clark described the immense difficulty of maintaining military discipline and morale when the very foundations of military life had been stripped away. We had to establish a chain of command immediately, Clark recalled, to prevent the men from sinking into a state of apathy that the Germans would exploit. This became a battle of wills. The senior officers organized classes, sports leagues, and even theatrical productions, all in an effort to create a semblance of purpose and routine. It was an internal conflict fought against an invisible enemy, despair. They understood that if the Germans could break their prisoners' spirit, they would become a docile, manageable population. The officers' war was to ensure that every man, despite his physical confinement, remained a soldier in his mind, ready to resist, to escape, to continue the fight by any means necessary. But their efforts were a constant struggle against the physical realities of near starvation and the psychological weight of indefinite internment. The sheer scale of the problem facing the German camp authorities was a direct result of the Allied strategic bombing campaign. The year 1943 was devastating for the US 8th Air Force. The infamous Black Week in October, which included the second raid on the Schweinfurt ball-bearing plants, saw catastrophic losses. On that single day, October 14th, the 8th Air Force lost 60 B-17 seconds, another 17 were damaged so badly they were written off, and 600 airmen were lost, killed, wounded, or captured. In that 1 week, 148 American bombers and their crews were wiped from the order of battle. This was an industrial-scale loss of highly trained personnel. Each 10-man crew represented thousands of hours of training and a massive investment by the Allied war machine. For the Germans, their capture was a double-edged sword. While it was a tactical victory for the Luftwaffe, it created a logistical nightmare on the ground. Suddenly, thousands of intelligent, disciplined, and defiant young men were flooding into the Stalag Luft transit camps and then into permanent stalags. The Wehrmacht's own logistical chains were already stretched to the breaking point by the war on two fronts. Providing adequate food, housing, and guards for this sudden influx of what they termed Terrorfliegers was a low priority. The official rations allocated to POWs were often barely at subsistence level, and frequently fell below it due to corruption, transportation breakdowns, or simple scarcity. The Germans were not equipped to manage this human consequence of the air war, creating a vacuum of supply that was as dangerous to the prisoners as any weapon. This statistical reality, born from the skies over the Reich, created the desperate conditions on the ground that would make the arrival of a simple box of provisions not just a welcome comfort, but an absolute necessity for survival. Thus, the newly captured Allied prisoner of war found himself in a state of total isolation. He was cut off from his country, his family, and his unit. He was physically weakened by poor nutrition and psychologically besieged by a system designed to crush his will. His past life was a distant memory, and his future was an unknowable, terrifying blank. In this barren landscape of barbed wire and deprivation, the mind clings to any symbol of hope, any tangible link to the world that was lost. It was into this void that the first rumors would filter, passed from veteran prisoners to the newcomers in hushed, reverent tones. They spoke of a promise, a logistical miracle that defied the front lines and the camp walls. They spoke of the Red Cross. In the closed, stagnant world of a prisoner of war camp, rumor was a currency as vital as bread. It was the barbed wire telegraph, a constant, unseen current of information, speculation, and hope that flowed through the barracks. For the newly captured man, still reeling from the shock and disorientation of his new reality, the stories told by the old-timers, the Kriegies who had been behind the wire for years, were a form of education in survival. They taught him the camp's unwritten rules, the personalities of the guards, and the art of making do with nothing. And among all the rumors, one stood out with the power of religious prophecy, the Red Cross Parcel. To a man subsisting on watery soup and a few ounces of black bread, the descriptions were fantastical. Tins of real meat, bars of chocolate, actual coffee, and packs of American or British cigarettes. At first, it sounded like a cruel joke, a fever dream born of starvation. It seemed impossible that a civilian organization, however well-intentioned, could penetrate the heart of the Third Reich in the midst of total war to deliver such luxuries. Yet the old-timers spoke of it with a certainty that was infectious. They described Parcel Day as a festival, a day when the entire camp's oppressive atmosphere would lift. The rumor was a seed of hope planted in the most barren soil, a promise that sustained men through the darkest moments of doubt. The anticipation on a day when a parcel delivery was expected was a palpable force. Bertram Jimmy James, a British RAF officer and a long-term resident of Stalag Luft III, captured the phenomenon in his recollections. The mood of thousands of men could pivot on the sight of a single truck approaching the camp gates. The arrival of the Red Cross Parcels was an event of unparalleled importance, he stated. It was a holiday, a feast day, a secular miracle. On those mornings, the usual lethargy of the camp would vanish. Men would gather near the wire, their eyes fixed on the road, waiting. The moment the truck, often driven by German guards but bearing the unmistakable Red Cross emblem, came into view, a wave of relief and quiet excitement would ripple through the compound. The process was meticulously organized by the prisoners' own internal leadership. The boxes would be unloaded under the watchful eyes of both German guards and senior Allied officers to ensure fairness. They were then taken to a central parcel store, managed by the prisoners, from which they were distributed, typically one per man per week, if supplies allowed. For James and his fellow prisoners, the ritual was as important as the contents. It was an act of organized, civilized order in a world of chaos. It was a moment where they, the prisoners, took control of a vital aspect of their own lives. Watching the stacks of familiar cardboard boxes grow was a visual confirmation of the thesis statement they all desperately needed to believe. They were not forgotten. For the individual prisoner, the act of receiving and opening that first parcel was a profoundly emotional experience, a sensory link to a life he thought he had lost forever. Major Richard A. Peterson, a P-47 Thunderbolt pilot shot down and captured in 1944, vividly described this moment. After weeks of meager German rations and the psychological grind of interrogation and transit camps, he was finally issued his first American Red Cross parcel. He wrote of carrying the 10-pound box back to his bunk with a reverence usually reserved for a holy object. "I took my time opening it," Peterson recalled, savoring every second. The box itself was from home. The printing, the brand names, it was all so wonderfully, beautifully American. Inside was a treasure trove. A can of Spam, powdered milk from Klim tins, oleomargarine, soluble coffee, Chesterfield or Camel cigarettes, bars of Hershey's chocolate, raisins, and biscuits. The smells alone were enough to transport him thousands of miles away. The aroma of the coffee was the smell of a Sunday morning kitchen. The sweetness of the chocolate was a memory of a corner store, a date with a girl, a life of simple, now unimaginable, pleasures. It was more than just calories. It was an injection of morale straight into the soul. Peterson noted that he, like many men, simply sat and looked at the contents for a long time before consuming anything. It was a tangible piece of home, a physical manifestation of the care and effort of millions of people on the other side of the world. It was the definitive answer to the prisoner's most terrifying question: "Does anyone know I'm still alive?" The answer was yes, and here was the proof. This personal, emotional moment in a Bavarian Stalag was the final link in a logistical chain of staggering complexity and scale. The legend of the parcel was built on an industrial and diplomatic miracle. The American Red Cross alone, between 1942 and 1945, shipped over 27 million food parcels to Allied prisoners of war. Each one was packed by an army of volunteers, mostly women, in centers in Philadelphia, New York, and Chicago. They were packed to exact specifications, designed by nutritionists to supplement the meager camp diet with a balance of fats, proteins, and sugars. The British and Canadian Red Cross organizations ran similarly massive operations. This river of material then had to navigate a world at war. The parcels were shipped in neutral flag vessels, primarily Swedish and Portuguese, to ports like Lisbon and Marseille. From there, they were loaded onto special Red Cross trains that were granted safe passage by all belligerents, a fragile agreement brokered and constantly monitored by the International Committee of the Red Cross in Geneva. This required a constant, delicate ballet of diplomacy. The ICRC delegates inspected the camps, monitored the distribution of parcels, and served as the intermediaries between the Allied governments and the German High Command. It was a system built on trust and the shared, if sometimes grudging, adherence to the 1,000, 929 Geneva Convention. The entire operation was a testament to a massive, organized, and deeply compassionate civilian effort running in parallel to the military war, a supply line of hope that stretched across contested oceans and active war zones. The arrival of that first parcel, therefore, fundamentally altered the prisoners' world. It shattered the sense of total isolation that the camp's barbed wire was designed to create. The abstract idea of home was no longer just a fading memory. It was a can of processed meat you could hold in your hand, a cigarette you could smoke, a cup of coffee you could drink. This tangible connection was an immediate and powerful antidote to despair. It provided not only the physical energy necessary for survival, but the psychological fuel for resistance. The Germans provided the bare minimum to keep a man alive. The Red Cross provided the means to truly live, to think, to plan, and to defy. The contents of that box would soon become the foundation of a complex internal economy, a source of raw materials for escape attempts, and a symbol of an allied industrial and organizational power that could reach a man even in the enemy's deepest prison. The glimmer in the gloom had arrived. To the uninitiated, it was a simple cardboard box weighing 10 pounds bound with twine. But to the Allied prisoner of war, the American Red Cross Parcel was a masterpiece of logistical design, a standardized kit engineered for maximum psychological and physiological impact. The unboxing was a ritual, a careful dissection of a piece of life-saving equipment. First, the feel of the waxed cardboard, a defense against the damp European climate. Then, peeling back the flaps revealed a dense, geometric puzzle of tins, packets, and bars. There was the iconic blue and white Klim tin of powdered whole milk from the Borden Company, a promise of calcium and fat. A can of Spam or corned beef from Hormel, solid, protein-rich meat. A small tin of oleomargarine, a packet of dried fruit, usually raisins or prunes, a block of processed cheese. 2D ration Hershey bars, designed not to melt in a soldier's pocket. A small box of salt and pepper. And nestled among them, the true luxuries. A packet of soluble coffee and a carton of 50 cigarettes, often Camels or Chesterfields. Each item was a marvel of 1,940 seconds food technology dehydrated, concentrated, and packaged to survive a transatlantic journey and a trip across a war-torn continent. It was not a random assortment of groceries. It was a carefully curated arsenal of calories and morale. Colonel Delmar T. Spivey, the senior American officer at the center compound of Stalag Luft III, understood the parcel's importance from a commander's and a physician's perspective. He saw firsthand what the German diet did to his men, the constant gnawing hunger, the loss of weight, the lethargy, and the onset of diseases born from malnutrition. The arrival of the parcels, in his view, was nothing short of a medical intervention. The Klim milk and the cheese were essential, Spivey documented in his post-war reports. We had men suffering from vitamin deficiencies, and the introduction of fats and proteins from the parcels had an immediate and visible effect on their health. The oleomargarine could be combined with German potatoes to create a palatable and calorie-dense meal. The powdered milk, when mixed with water, was a source of vital nutrients that the camp diet of turnip soup and black bread completely lacked. For men who were slowly starving, the parcel was a weekly transfusion of life. Spivey noted the psychological shift was just as critical. A man with a full stomach was a man who could think clearly, who could maintain his discipline, and who could focus on the vital task of resisting the enemy, even while a prisoner. The parcel directly countered the German strategy of control through deprivation. It was, in Spivey's analysis, a fundamental tool for maintaining the health and fighting spirit of his command. The unique composition of the American parcel made it the gold standard within the multinational population of the camps. British prisoners, who received their own Red Cross parcels, looked upon the American version with a mixture of admiration and envy. FLT, Laventrusant, Richard S. Dick Churchill, one of the key organizers of the Great Escape from Stalag Luft III, often spoke of the internal camp economy and the relative value of goods. The British parcel was excellent, containing essentials like tea, biscuits, hardtack, and bully beef. But the American parcel contained items of almost unimaginable luxury. The Yanks had things we could only dream of, Churchill recalled. Tinned fruit cocktail, for instance, or that wonderful soluble coffee. Our tea was vital, of course, but a spoonful of their coffee was a taste of another world. This disparity immediately created a vibrant barter system. An American prisoner who didn't smoke could trade his 50 cigarettes for multiple items from a British or Canadian parcel. The Hershey bars were a form of high-value currency, hoarded and traded for specific, desired goods or services. This comparative value was not a source of resentment, but rather a catalyst for a complex, inter-allied marketplace. The American parcel, with its unique and highly desirable contents, became the benchmark against which all other camp commodities were measured. This superiority was no accident. It was a direct reflection of the industrial and agricultural might of the United States. Each item in the box was a product of a vast, efficient, and technologically advanced civilian economy repurposed for war. Hormel Foods in Minnesota was churning out millions of cans of Spam, a product that could remain preserved for years. The Borden Company's Klim brand was a triumph of food science, a stable and easily transportable form of milk. Hershey, Pennsylvania, was producing billions of D-ration bars to military specifications. R.J. Reynolds and Liggett and Myers were supplying the cigarettes that would become the camp's primary currency. The parcel itself was a lesson in packaging and logistics. Food scientists and quartermaster experts had calculated the optimal balance of weight, volume, and caloric content. The goal was to pack the maximum nutritional value into the smallest, most durable container possible. In essence, the American Red Cross Parcel was a projection of power. It was a message sent directly into the heart of the enemy's territory, saying, "Our factories can produce so much, our logistics are so good, that we can afford to send these high-quality provisions to our captured men, even in the midst of a global war." It was a care package that doubled as a weapon of economic and psychological warfare. Ultimately, the specific and standardized nature of the parcel's contents was its most revolutionary feature. Because every American prisoner received the exact same collection of goods, a baseline of value was instantly established. Every man knew precisely what a can of Spam, a bar of chocolate, or a pack of Chesterfields was worth, because he had his own to compare it to. This uniformity and universal desirability provided the perfect conditions for the emergence of a sophisticated economy. The parcel was not just a lifeline, it was a wallet. It was the capital injection that would fuel a new kind of war behind the wire, one fought not with guns, but with coffee, chocolate, and cigarettes. In any society, where there is scarcity, there is economics. But inside a prisoner of war camp, the conventional rules of economics were meaningless. The German Reichsmark was worthless paper, and the Allied currency in a man's pocket was a useless souvenir. The initial system was simple, inefficient barter. A man with a spare shirt might trade it for a piece of bread. But this system was clumsy. It required a double coincidence of once the man with the shirt had to find a man who both had bread to spare and wanted a shirt. What the camp desperately needed was a medium of exchange, a commodity that was universally accepted, easily divisible, portable, and relatively durable. It needed a currency. The solution arrived in the Red Cross parcels. While every item had value, one item fulfilled all the requirements of money perfectly: the cigarette. It came in a standardized unit, a single cig, and a standardized larger denomination, a pack of 20. It was desired by smokers and non-smokers alike, because even a non-smoker knew he could trade it for something else. The supply, while not perfectly stable, was regulated by the weekly parcel deliveries. And so, almost overnight, the entire economic system of camps like Stalag Luft III realigned itself around a new, smoky gold standard. The spontaneous evolution of this complex system was brilliantly documented by R.A. Radford, a British prisoner captured in Libya, who after the war wrote a paper titled The Economic Organization of a POW Camp. It became a foundational text for economics students, as it was a perfect real-world illustration of classical economic theory. Radford, observing his fellow prisoners with an academic eye, noted how a sophisticated market emerged from the chaos of barter. A board in the exchange and mart room would display prices, he wrote. In cigarettes, of course. A price list might read, a tin of jam, 80 cigarettes, a bar of chocolate, 20, a tin of cheese, 40. A man receiving his weekly parcel containing a carton of cigarettes was, for a brief time, wealthy. He could use his income to purchase the specific goods he desired from others. This led to specialization and trade. A Frenchman might trade his coffee for an Englishman's tea. An American non-smoker could effectively sell his entire cigarette ration for a diverse portfolio of foodstuffs that would last him the week. Radford even observed the emergence of complex financial instruments. A robust system of credit, known as TIC, developed, where a man could receive goods with the promise to pay on the next parcel day. Entrepreneurs emerged, men who would walk the camp's circuits, engaging in arbitrage, buying an item for a low price in one barrack and selling it for a profit in another, where it was more desired. The camp had, in effect, spontaneously generated a system of commerce complete with a price mechanism, credit, and a professional merchant class. This economic activity was also a powerful social force, as documented by men like Fult Lieutenant Charles W. Dryden, a Tuskegee airman held at Stalag Luft III. The cigarette economy transcended nationality and rank, creating a common language of commerce that bound the Allied prisoners together. Dryden observed how this trade fostered communication and relationships between Americans, British, Canadians, Poles, and others. A shared understanding of the value of a cig created a basis for interaction that went beyond military camaraderie. A man's economic savvy could significantly improve his quality of life. A prisoner skilled in tailoring might offer his services for a fee of cigarettes. An artist could draw portraits of fellow prisoners in exchange for the cigarettes needed to buy extra food. This created a service economy that ran in parallel to the trade in goods. A man standing in the camp could be subtly influenced by his wealth. Those who managed their cigarette income wisely ate better, had better mended clothes, and could afford small luxuries that made life more bearable. For Dryden and his fellow airmen, participating in this economy was an act of agency. In a world where their captors controlled every aspect of their physical lives, controlling their own personal economy was a way to reclaim a piece of their independence and identity. It was a constant, daily reaffirmation that they were not just numbers, but thinking individuals capable of creating a complex social and economic order. The camp's stock market was a living entity, exquisitely sensitive to the laws of supply and demand. The exchange rates were not fixed. They fluctuated based on camp-wide events and rumors. The baseline value of the American cigarette, the hard currency of the camp, was the benchmark against which everything was measured. However, the value of goods in relation to that cigarette could change dramatically. For example, if a large shipment of parcels arrived on schedule, the market would be flooded with goods. This created deflation. The purchasing power of the cigarette went up, and the price of goods in cigarettes went down. That tin of jam that cost 80 cigarettes last week might now only cost 60. Conversely, if a parcel shipment was delayed, or if rumors spread that the supply line had been cut, the effect was immediate and severe inflation. Goods became scarce and prices skyrocketed. Men hoarded their tinned food, and a D-bar might cost 40 or 50 cigarettes. The market sentiment could be described as bullish when parcels were plentiful and bearish during times of scarcity. Even the weather could affect prices. A sudden cold snap would increase the demand for coffee and cocoa, and their price in cigarettes would rise accordingly. This entire system was a microcosm of a national economy, complete with market shocks, inflation, deflation, and commodity speculation, all played out on a stage of barbed wire and wooden huts. In the final analysis, The cigarette economy was one of the most profound and successful forms of psychological resistance practiced by Allied prisoners. On the surface, it was about food and comfort, but at its core, it was about rebuilding a shattered world. The prisoners took the raw materials provided by the Red Cross and used them to construct a complex, functioning society in defiance of their captors. The mental energy required to track prices, to budget, to trade, and to speculate kept minds sharp and active, fighting off the lethargy and despair that the Germans hoped to cultivate. It gave the men a sense of purpose beyond simple survival. By creating and participating in this economy, they were practicing the principles of a free and open society, even while imprisoned by a totalitarian one. They were proving, on a daily basis, that the spirit of ingenuity, cooperation, and commerce could not be extinguished by a barbed wire fence. For the average prisoner, the Red Cross parcel was a week's worth of calories and a taste of home. Once the food was consumed and the cigarettes smoked, its primary purpose seemed fulfilled. But for a select group of men in every camp, the X-organization, the escape committee, the consumption of the food was merely the first step in a vital industrial process. This was the parcel's second life. When the contents were gone, the packaging, the tins, the cardboard, and the twine became the most valuable raw materials in the camp. The Kriegi, the Allied slang for Kriegsgefangener or prisoner of war, was a master of improvisation, a scavenger, and an engineer. His mind, sharpened by boredom and desperation, saw not a pile of trash, but a warehouse of untapped potential. This was not idle hobbycraft. It was a covert war of manufacturing, turning the instruments of humanitarian aid into the tools of defiance and escape. The engineering heart of this secret industry in Stalag Luft III was a Canadian mining engineer, LT Wally Floody, known to all as the Tunnel King. He was the chief architect of the three ambitious tunnels, Tom, Dick, and Harry. His greatest challenge was not just digging, but keeping the diggers alive. A tunnel stretching hundreds of feet underground would quickly become an oxygen-starved death trap. It needed ventilation. The solution, Floody realized, lay in the camp's garbage pits, piled high with empty Klim powdered milk tins. As he later described, the tins were our salvation. They were a standard size, reasonably strong, and available in the hundreds. Under his direction, a secret production line was established. Prisoners would collect the tins, carefully remove both ends, and then fit them together, soldering or crimping the edges to create a continuous, square-profile air duct. For the monumental tunnel Harry, this ductwork, made from nearly 1,000 individual Klim tins, would stretch for over 300 feet. But a duct was useless without an air pump. Again, Kriegi ingenuity provided. Using bed boards, a hockey stick, and a canvas kit bag, Floody's team constructed a powerful, hand-operated bellows pump. Hidden in a hollowed-out section of a barrack stove, this pump would draw fresh air from the surface and force it down the long tin plate artery, providing precious oxygen to the men working at the tunnel face. It was a miracle of salvage engineering, a fully functional ventilation system built entirely from refuse and stolen materials. While Floody's teams handled the heavy engineering, other departments of the X organization focused on the finer details of escape. Des Plunkett, an RAF pilot, was in charge of the map-making department. His team was tasked with producing hundreds of accurate, pocket-sized maps of Germany and the occupied territories, essential for any escaped prisoner hoping to make it to neutral territory. This work required precision, secrecy, and light. To work at night, they devised the fat lamp. As Plunkett recounted, we used a small tin, like a sardine can, filled it with margarine from the parcels, and used a piece of pajama cord for a wick. It gave off a clear, smokeless light, perfect for our purposes. This simple invention allowed the forgers and map-makers to work through the night, hidden under blankets in their bunks. The parcel provided not just fuel for the lamp, but other critical materials. Gelatin from packets of Jell-O could be used to create reproduction German stamps for forged identity papers. The lead foil from cigarette packets could be melted down. The entire operation was a testament to meticulous, multidisciplinary ingenuity. Tailors turned blankets into civilian coats, carpenters turned bedboards into tunnel shoring, and tinsmiths turned food cans into digging tools and air ducts. Every part of the parcel had a purpose, and every prisoner with a skill was recruited into this clandestine factory. The industrial scale of this operation was staggering. It was a secret factory operating in plain sight, with a conversion rate that would impress a modern recycling plant. Consider the raw materials provided by a single delivery of 1,000 Red Cross parcels. This would yield approximately 1,000 Klim tins. When flattened, this provided hundreds of square feet of usable sheet metal for everything from digging tools to the blades of the ventilation pump. The cardboard boxes themselves, when pulped and mixed with water and German dust, could be used to create counterfeit wall sections to hide the tunnel entrances. The twine binding the boxes was unraveled and braided into ropes. Electrically, while the Germans provided the power to the barracks, it was the prisoners who rewired it. They would steal lengths of wire from unused circuits, insulating it with melted rubber boot heels, and run lighting down into the tunnels, powered by the camp's own grid. The human capital was just as impressive. The X-organization in Stalag Luft III comprised hundreds of men, each with a specialized role. There were the diggers who worked at the face, the carpenters who shored up the tunnels with stolen bedboards, the dispersal teams who secretly disposed of the excavated sand, and the security force of stooges who kept watch for German guards. This was not a handful of men with spoons. This was a battalion, strength engineering and intelligence unit. This massive, coordinated effort represented the ultimate transformation of the Red Cross Parcel. It was a lifeline that had been systematically weaponized. The Germans saw a humanitarian convoy delivering food to sustain their prisoners and keep them docile. The prisoners saw a logistical pipeline delivering the raw materials for war. Every can of milk, every cardboard box, every scrap of foil was a contribution to the ongoing fight. The ingenuity of the Kriegi turned the camp itself into a battleground, a place where a hidden war of engineering, manufacturing, and logistics was fought every single day. The parcel was intended to preserve life, and it did, but it also fueled a relentless, industrial-scale effort to reclaim freedom, proving that even behind barbed wire, the Allied spirit of invention and resistance could not be contained. To see the war from the Allied side of the wire is to see a story of deprivation and resistance. But to understand the full picture, one must step across the warning wire and into the office of the camp commandant. This was not always the monocled, jack-booted caricature of propaganda films. In many Luftwaffe-run camps, particularly for officers, the commandant was a professional soldier, often a veteran of the First World War, bound by a code of military honor that was increasingly at odds with the radical ideology of the Nazi Party. He was a man caught in an impossible position, tasked with guarding thousands of his nation's most determined enemies, while simultaneously being legally obligated by international treaty to ensure their humane treatment. His war was not fought with bullets, but with bureaucracy, logistics, and a constant, draining battle of wits against the very men he was charged with protecting. He had to contend with the collapsing German supply chain, the ever-present threat of the Gestapo, and the infuriating, brilliant ingenuity of his prisoners. The commandant of Stalag Luft III, Oberst Friedrich Wilhelm von Lindeiner-Wildau, was the archetype of this complex figure. He was an old-school Prussian aristocrat, not a fervent Nazi. He had served in the German colonial forces in Africa before the First World War, and was a man who understood the soldier's code. He insisted that the Allied officer prisoners be treated with the respect due to their rank, as stipulated by the Geneva Convention. Historical records and prisoner testimonies note that von Lindeiner frequently met with the senior Allied officer, Colonel Spivey, to discuss camp conditions. He fought with his own superiors in the Wehrmacht bureaucracy for better rations and supplies for his prisoners. He allowed the prisoners to manage their own internal affairs, including the all-important distribution of Red Cross parcels. This was not necessarily born of sympathy for the Allied cause, but from a deep-seated belief in professional military conduct and a pragmatic understanding that a well-fed, orderly camp was a more secure camp. However, this adherence to an older code put him on a collision course with the more sinister elements of the Nazi state. He was aware of the constant escape attempts, and while he did his duty to prevent them, he treated it as a professional game of cat and mouse, not an ideological crusade. This gentleman's war was shattered by the brutal reality of the Nazi regime's other face, the SS and the Gestapo. Following the Great Escape in March 1944, the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe lost control of the situation. The escape of 76 officers was a profound embarrassment to the Reich and an infuriating act of defiance. The response came not from the military, but directly from the highest echelons of the Nazi Party. Adolf Hitler was reportedly enraged, and it was Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, who issued the infamous Sagan-Befehl, Sagan Order. The order was clear and savage. More than half of the recaptured escapers were to be executed. This was a flagrant violation of the Geneva Convention, which stipulated that the punishment for an escape attempt was to be disciplinary action, such as solitary confinement. The Wehrmacht, and men like von Lindeiner, were powerless to stop it. The Gestapo took custody of the recaptured men, drove them to remote locations in small groups, and shot them, claiming they had been shot while trying to escape. The murder of the 50 escapers was a chilling message. The old rules of honor were dead. For the prisoners, it was a horrifying confirmation of the evil they were fighting. For von Lindeiner, it was a personal and professional disgrace. He was removed from his command and even faced a court-martial, saved only by his connections. The incident starkly illustrated the dual conflict within the German war machine itself, the struggle between the traditional military and the fanatical ideologues of the party. The foundation for all these complex interactions was a single, powerful document, the Geneva Convention of 1929. For the Germans, this was not just a treaty, it was a logistical mandate with immense statistical implications. Article 11 of the Convention stated that the food ration for prisoners of war was to be equivalent in quantity and quality to that of the depot troops of the detaining power. By 1943, with the Eastern Front bleeding the Wehrmacht dry and Allied bombing crippling production, the German depot troop ration was itself meagre. The German civilian population was on strict rationing. To provide tens of thousands of Allied POWs with a diet equivalent to their own soldiers was a logistical impossibility. The German war economy, already strained to its breaking point, simply could not produce the required calories. Here, the Red Cross Parcel ceased to be a simple humanitarian gesture and became a crucial component of German administrative strategy. By allowing the parcels into the camps, the Germans were effectively outsourcing their treaty obligations. Each 10-pound American parcel represented a week's worth of calories and nutrients that the German state did not have to provide. It was a pragmatic, if not entirely willing, admission that they could not meet their legal requirements under international law without the help of their enemies' own civilian relief organizations. This created the central, maddening irony for the German camp command. The very parcels that allowed them to fulfill their duties under the Geneva Convention and keep their prisoners from starving were the same parcels being systematically dismantled and weaponized against them. The commandant knew that the Klim tins were becoming air ducts. He knew the cigarettes were funding the camp's black market, which was used to bribe guards for escape materials. He knew the margarine was lighting the forgers' secret workshops. Yet he was legally bound to allow the delivery of this Trojan horse, week after week. To refuse the parcels would be to openly violate the convention, inviting reprisals against German prisoners in Allied hands, and risking the censure of the neutral protecting powers. To accept them was to knowingly supply the enemy's war effort inside his own camp. This was the tightrope the German commandant had to walk every day, a constant, unwinnable struggle between honor, duty, law, and the relentless, resourceful defiance of the men behind the wire. In a vast, cavernous warehouse in Philadelphia, far from the roar of combat, Another kind of army waged its own relentless war. This army wore not helmets but hairnets. Its weapons were not rifles, but rolls of packing tape and scoops for powdered milk. It was an army of volunteers, tens of thousands strong, composed primarily of women, mothers, wives, and sisters of the men fighting overseas. Here, in the methodical, rhythmic clamour of a dozen assembly lines, the Red Cross Parcel began its improbable journey. Each woman had her station. One would place the tin of Spam into the box, another the Klim milk, a third the Hershey bars. Their movements were precise, efficient, and imbued with a profound sense of purpose. They were not just packing groceries, they were packing hope. They were the first, critical link in a logistical chain that would stretch 5,000 miles, a supply line of compassion that aimed to pierce the very heart of the enemy's fortress. The air hummed with the noise of industry, but it was an industry fueled by patriotism and a deeply personal connection to the unknown man who would, weeks or months later, open the box they now held in their hands. The archives of the American Red Cross are filled with the voices of these volunteers, captured in letters and internal newsletters. Their words reveal a motivation that went far beyond simple civic duty. For many, the work was a direct, tangible way to participate in the war effort and to combat the feeling of helplessness that came with having a loved one in harm's way. A letter from a Philadelphia volunteer named Eleanor B. Wallace, dated May 1943, reads, "My son is a navigator on a B-17. I do not know where he is, but I know that somewhere, some mother's son is a prisoner. Every tin of coffee I pack is for him, and I pray that some other mother, somewhere, is doing the same for my boy." This sentiment was universal. The volunteers saw the face of their own son, husband, or brother in every parcel. Internal reports from the period emphasized the meticulous nature of the work, noting the extraordinary care and pride the volunteers took in their task. They knew the parcels would be opened in a place of despair, and they saw themselves as sending a direct message of love and support from the home front. This was not a detached act of charity. It was an intimate act of war against loneliness and fear, a collective effort by millions of ordinary citizens to reach across an ocean and a battlefield to touch the life of a single soldier. Once packed and crated, the parcels began the most perilous leg of their journey. This was the domain of the International Committee of the ICRC in Geneva. Here, the war was fought not with bombs but with telegrams, diplomatic cables, and high-stakes negotiations. Delegates like the celebrated Dr. Marcel Junod were masters of this complex world. Their task was to maintain the fragile diplomatic framework that allowed the Red Cross to operate. They had to secure guarantees of safe passage from both the Allied and Axis powers for the neutral-flagged ships that would carry the precious cargo. A typical vessel, like the Swedish freighter SS Vega, would be painted with massive red crosses on its hull and deck, making it an unmistakable, protected vessel under international law. But the North Atlantic was a lethal hunting ground for German U-boats, and Allied command was wary of any ship heading for enemy-controlled ports. As Junod's memoirs attest, the process was fraught with tension. A single U-boat commander who failed to identify the ship correctly, or an Allied naval patrol that suspected the cargo was not what it seemed, could sever the lifeline in an instant. The delegates in Lisbon and Geneva were in constant communication, tracking the ships, clearing them with military authorities, and resolving diplomatic incidents. It was a nerve-wracking, invisible battle to keep the artery of hope open. The sheer scale of this logistical chain is difficult to comprehend. By the end of the war, the American Red Cross had shipped a staggering 27,535,466 food parcels. Let us trace the journey of just one shipment. It would begin in Philadelphia, travel by rail to a port like New York, and be loaded onto a neutral ship. The sea voyage to Lisbon, Portugal, a distance of over 3,300 miles, could take weeks, navigating the dangerous Atlantic. In Lisbon, the cargo would be transferred to a dedicated Red Cross train. This train, granted safe passage, would then begin a journey of over 1,500 miles across neutral Spain, occupied France, and into the heart of Germany. Every mile of this journey was a potential point of failure. The train lines in France were a primary target for Allied bombers and the French resistance. German military transports had absolute priority on the rails, meaning the Red Cross trains were often delayed for days or weeks. Yet, against all odds, the system worked. Millions of tons of life-saving food, medicine, and supplies, representing a monumental investment of civilian effort and an industrial output that ran parallel to military production, successfully navigated the most violent conflict in human history. This immense, globe-spanning effort, involving the labor of thousands of volunteers, the industrial might of American factories, and the delicate maneuvering of international diplomats, finally culminated in a single, quiet moment. A prisoner in a wooden barrack in Bavaria, thousands of miles from home, would hold in his hands a 10-pound cardboard box. The journey of that box was a symphony of industrial noise, the clang of the factory, the rumble of the freight train, the churning of the ship's engines. But its arrival was silent, personal, and profound. Its true value could not be measured in its 4,500 calories, but in the millions of man-hours and thousands of miles of peril it represented. It was the physical embodiment of a promise, proof that a vast and powerful network of human compassion was fighting for him, a silent, unseen ally in his personal war for survival. The military is an institution built upon the bedrock of hierarchy. From the moment a man enlists, he is taught to understand the intricate pyramid of rank. A salute is not a greeting, it is a formal recognition of a superior's authority. Officers eat in separate messes, live in separate quarters, and are granted privileges and responsibilities far beyond those of the enlisted man. This rigid structure, honed over centuries, was not abandoned at the gates of a prisoner of war camp. It was imported wholesale. In the sprawling stalags of Germany, officers were housed in their own compounds, segregated from the NCOs and privates. The chain of command was meticulously re-established, providing a framework for discipline and internal governance. It was a world defined by the insignia on a man's collar. How then could this deeply ingrained social and military order be challenged? Not by a mutiny or a collapse in discipline, but by the quiet, persistent, and radically egalitarian logic of a standardized cardboard box. For the enlisted man, life behind the wire was often a harsher reality. While the Geneva Convention set minimum standards, the day-to-day existence in the enlisted compounds could be more crowded, and the German rations even more sparse. The diary of Sergeant Frank Fujita provides an invaluable ground-level perspective. A Japanese-American Nisei from Texas, Fujita was part of the lost battalion of the 36th Infantry Division, captured in Java. As an enlisted man, he was not just a soldier but a worker, often forced into labor details by his German captors. His diary entries are a testament to a constant struggle against hunger. For Fujita and his comrades, the Red Cross Parcel was not a welcome supplement to their diet. It was the very foundation of it. He writes not of grand escape plans, but of the immediate, all-consuming business of survival, the careful rationing of a tin of corned beef, the joy of a piece of chocolate, the endless calculations of trade. But the parcel gave him something more than calories. It gave him economic power. On the day the parcels were distributed, Sergeant Fujita, a man with limited military authority and a member of a racial minority, was instantly as wealthy as any officer in the next compound. His weekly allotment of goods was his capital, and in the bustling camp marketplace, he was a free agent. He could bargain, he could save, he could trade his cigarettes for a warmer pair of socks or a portion of someone else's cheese. In the economic sphere, he was the equal of any man, a fact that stood in stark contrast to the rigid hierarchy of his military life. From the other side of the compound fence, senior officers like the British group Captain Harry Wingsday worked tirelessly to maintain the structure and discipline they believed was essential for morale and survival. Day, as a senior British officer, was the de facto commander of thousands of men, and the preservation of the military chain of command was his primary duty. Yet, he and other officers were astute observers of the unique society developing within their prison. While official interactions between officers and enlisted men remained formal, the parcel economy created a powerful, unofficial back-channel of communication and exchange. Group Captain Day would have witnessed the undeniable reality. The universal distribution of parcels acted as a powerful democratizing force. A young pilot officer, perhaps a university graduate from a privileged background, who desperately wanted the pipe tobacco from a British parcel, might find that the only way to get it was to trade the desirable American coffee from his own parcel. The owner of that tobacco might be a grizzled sergeant from a working-class background. In that transaction, conducted through the wire or via a trusted intermediary, their ranks were momentarily erased. They were not an officer and an NCO, they were two businessmen striking a deal. The negotiation was based not on authority, but on the mutually agreed value of their goods. The parcel forced men of all ranks and classes to engage with each other on a level playing field, creating a social fluidity that the rigid military structure was designed to prevent. The revolutionary engine behind this social shift was the Red Cross's simple but profound distribution policy. One man, one parcel. This was not a detail, it was the core principle, and its statistical impact was immense. Consider a large camp with a mixed population of 10,000 Allied prisoners. A successful weekly delivery of American parcels represented a massive, camp-wide economic stimulus package. Each of those 10,000 men, from the highest-ranking colonel to the lowest-ranking private, received one identical box. Inside each box was a carton of 50 cigarettes. Therefore, on a single parcel day, a total of 500,000 cigarettes were injected into the camp's economy. The critical factor was the perfectly flat and equal distribution of this new capital. A private, who in the outside world's military pay system might earn a tiny fraction of a colonel's salary, received the exact same weekly economic stimulus of 50 cigarettes and a full parcel of goods. This instantly leveled the economic landscape. A man's wealth was no longer tied to his rank but to his weekly parcel and his cleverness in managing it. This created a true free market, where an enlisted man with a knack for trade could achieve a standard of living measured in food variety and small comforts that was equal to, or even greater than that of a less economically astute officer. In the end, the Red Cross parcel performed an unintentional social miracle. It temporarily dissolved a military hierarchy that was centuries in the making. By making every prisoner an independent economic actor with an equal and regular supply of capital, it bypassed the traditional structures of authority and privilege. In the vibrant, chaotic marketplace of the camp, a man was judged not by the insignia on his uniform, but by the value of the goods he possessed and his skill in negotiation. This was more than just a matter of food. It was a profound psychological victory. It was a daily reminder of a civilian world where an individual's worth was determined by his own enterprise. The great equalizer had arrived behind the barbed wire, not in the form of a political manifesto or a rebellion, but in a simple, standardized 10-pound box of groceries. In the winter of 1944, in a barrack in Stalag Luft III, an American navigator might write in his diary about the crushing monotony of a diet of German bread and potatoes, a diet made bearable only by the tinned meat and coffee from his weekly Red Cross parcel. He might complain that the prunes in this month's shipment were of a lesser quality. A few miles down the road, perhaps just on the other side of a railway line, a captured soldier of the Red Army, Ivan, lies on a frozen mud floor, his body consuming itself. He has not seen a parcel, a letter, or a sign of outside aid since the day he was captured. His daily ration is a cup of watery turnip soup and a piece of bread made with sawdust. The American dreams of home. Ivan dreams of a potato peel. The difference between these two men is not their courage or their cause. It is not the distance separating their prisons. The difference between a life of hardship and a sentence of death is a piece of paper. A treaty signed in Geneva in 1929, which one man's nation had ratified and the others had not. The reality of the times, Russenlager *, the camps designated for Soviet prisoners, was a descent into a hell purposefully constructed by Nazi ideology. The Nazi regime considered Slavic peoples to be times Untermenschen *, subhumans, and their treatment of captured Soviet soldiers was a direct and brutal application of this racial theory. The journalist and author Vasily Grossman, whose notebooks chronicled the war on the Eastern Front, documented the systematic nature of this cruelty. Soviet POWs were not seen as soldiers protected by international law, but as a disposable resource to be worked to death. Upon capture, they were stripped of their winter clothing and often marched for days without food or water to camps that were little more than open-air pens enclosed by barbed wire. The official ration was designed for extermination, often amounting to less than 700 calories a day, a fraction of what is needed for basic human survival. Disease, typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis ran rampant, unchecked by any medical care. Brutal beatings from guards were a daily occurrence. There was no Red Cross, no protecting power, no lifeline. It was a closed system of calculated industrial-scale murder through starvation and neglect. For the Western Allied prisoners who occasionally witnessed this horror, the experience was profoundly shocking and perspective-altering. Major Pat Reed, a British officer and escape artist, described in his memoirs the moments when he saw columns of Soviet prisoners being marched to labor details. They were, he wrote, skeletal figures, shuffling skeletons in rags, with dead eyes that held no spark of hope. Allied prisoners would sometimes try to throw scraps of food over the wire to them, an act that could earn a severe beating from the German guards if caught. The sight of these starving men created a deep and unsettling sense of guilt and an immediate recalibration of their own suffering. The complaints about the lack of variety in the Red Cross parcels, the boredom, the longing for home, all seemed like obscene luxuries in the face of the walking death they saw on the other side of the fence. It was a stark, visual lesson in the hierarchy of Nazi racial policy. They, the British and Americans, were a nuisance to be contained. The Soviets were a pestilence to be eradicated. This horrifying proximity to a genuine policy of extermination made their own situation, as grim as it was, seem like a state of profound privilege. The numbers tell the story with a brutality that words cannot fully capture. Of the approximately 232,000 British and American prisoners held by the Germans during the Second World War, roughly 8,300 died in captivity. This is a mortality rate of just under 4%. It is a tragic figure, but one that reflects conditions where survival was the norm. For Soviet prisoners of war, the statistics are apocalyptic. Of the 5.7 million Red Army soldiers captured by the Germans, an estimated 3.3 million died. This is a mortality rate of 57.5%. The primary reason for this staggering discrepancy lies in the cold, legalistic interpretation of international law. The Soviet Union was not a signatory to the 1929 Geneva Convention. While the Nazi regime barely adhered to the treaty's spirit even with the Western Allies, they used the USSR's non-signatory status as a legal and moral justification for their campaign of annihilation. It meant they could, without fear of legal reprisal, deny the ICRC access to the camps. It meant they could implement starvation rations. It meant they could work the prisoners to death in mines and factories in direct violation of every tenet of the laws of war. The Germans created a legal vacuum, and into that vacuum they poured their most vicious ideological hatred. The true, immeasurable value of the Red Cross parcel is therefore found not in what it contained, but in what its absence meant. To the American airman, the box was a supplement, a comfort, a taste of home. To the Soviet soldier, the existence of such a box would have been a miracle, a sign that the world regarded him as a human being. The parcel was the physical manifestation of a legal status. It was the end result of a system, however flawed, that was built on the premise that a captured soldier retained a fundamental humanity. For the Soviet POW, that premise was denied. He was cut off not just from his home, but from the entire community of nations that had deemed such protections necessary. He was alone, forgotten by the world and targeted for destruction by his captors. The story of the parcel is a story of contrasts, of hope against despair, of humanity against ideology, and ultimately of a piece of cardboard and its contents drawing a stark, undeniable line between a chance to live and an almost certain sentence of death. The Great Escape from Stalag Luft III in March 1944 is etched into history as a saga of audacious courage and meticulous planning. The story of the tunnels Tom, Dick, and especially Harry, dug by hand under the very noses of their German captors, is a legend of military defiance. But beneath the legend of the tunnels lies an untold story of logistics. This monumental feat of engineering and organization, involving over 600 prisoners, was not accomplished with courage alone. It was a complex industrial enterprise that required funding, raw materials, and a well-fed, highly motivated workforce. The silent, uncredited partner in this enterprise, the venture capitalist and primary supplier for the entire operation, was the humble Red Cross Parcel. Without the constant, reliable infusion of its goods, currency, and calories, the Great Escape would have been an impossible dream. The entire escape operation was a black market masterpiece, and its currency was the cigarette. Paul Brickhill, an Australian Spitfire pilot and prisoner who chronicled the escape in his famous book, was the unofficial historian of the X organization. His accounts detail an intricate web of bribery and trade that was essential for acquiring materials that could not be scavenged or manufactured from the parcels themselves. The escape committee needed specific, high-value items, German railway timetables, identity card blanks, high-quality compasses, and radio components to build a secret receiver for news from the BBC. These could only be obtained from German guards. Brickhill describes how certain guards, often disillusioned or simply greedy, were identified as being bribable. The transactions were never conducted with cash, but with the goods that cigarettes could buy. A friendly guard might be offered a steady supply of chocolate and coffee for his family, Brickhill wrote. The payment was made in cigarettes, the universally accepted currency. This cigarette-fueled trade network was the lifeblood of the escape, allowing the X organization to purchase the critical intelligence and equipment needed to turn their tunnel into a viable path to freedom. The plan was the brainchild of squadron leader Roger Bushell, a brilliant and ruthless organizer known as Big X. Bushell's vision was not just for a handful of men to escape, but for a massive breakout of 200 officers, an act designed to cause maximum disruption and chaos for the German war machine. Executing this vision required a colossal amount of human energy. For over a year, hundreds of men were engaged in grueling physical labor digging at the tunnel face, operating the ventilation pump, and dispersing tons of sand. Others worked equally long hours in clandestine workshops, forging documents, tailoring clothes, and drawing maps. This sustained, high-intensity effort would have been physically impossible on the meager German rations. The accounts of Bushell's fellow plotters emphasize his obsession with the well-being of his workforce. The extra calories provided by the parcel's tinned meat, cheese, and chocolate were the essential fuel that powered the human engine of the escape. The coffee kept the forgers alert through the night. The cigarettes provided a vital psychological release during moments of high stress. Bushell understood that the morale and physical strength of his team were his most critical assets, and those assets were directly sustained and replenished by the weekly delivery of the Red Cross parcels. The Great Escape can be analyzed not just as a military operation, but as a major construction project with a detailed budget, all denominated in Red Cross goods. The X organization's internal accounting was meticulous. It is estimated that the bribes paid to German guards for essential contraband amounted to over 20,000 cigarettes. This is the equivalent of the entire cigarette ration from 400 Red Cross parcels, a staggering amount of the camp's primary currency diverted towards the escape effort. The industrial output was even more impressive. The map department, under Day Plunkett, produced over 4,000 maps. The forgery department, led by Tim Wallen, created more than 200 sets of highly convincing identity papers, passes, and travel permits. The tailoring department converted military uniforms and blankets into hundreds of sets of civilian clothing. All of this was accomplished while the main engineering effort excavated and disposed of over 100 tons of bright yellow sand, a logistical nightmare in itself. Each phase of this operation, from the energy of the diggers to the ink on the forged documents, was directly or indirectly fueled by the contents of tens of thousands of parcels consumed over the course of a year. In the final analysis, the story of the Great Escape is inextricably linked to the story of the Red Cross Parcel. The escape was a triumph of human spirit, but it was also a triumph of logistics, planning, and resource management. The parcels provided the venture capital that funded the bribes. They supplied the raw materials for tools and equipment. Most importantly, they delivered the essential calories and morale that sustained the hundreds of men who pushed the project forward, day after grueling day. The tunnel, Harry, was built with stolen bedboards and powered by human muscle, but it was financed by cigarettes and fueled by spam. The Red Cross Parcel, an instrument of peace and humanitarian aid, became the indispensable logistical backbone for one of the most audacious acts of war ever conducted from behind a barbed wire fence. The autumn of 1944 was a season of intoxicating hope behind the wire. Following the D-Day landings and the rapid Allied breakout across France, the barbed wire telegraph buzzed with optimistic predictions. The German war machine was collapsing. The front lines were racing towards the Reich. The consensus in the barracks of every Stalag was that the war would be over by Christmas. Men began to speak not of escape, but of liberation. This heady atmosphere, however, was a prelude to the darkest and most desperate chapter of their captivity. The Allied advance stalled as it hit the German border. Then, in December, the shocking news of the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, filtered into the camps, a brutal reminder of the enemy's resilience. Compounding this psychological blow was a far more immediate crisis. The same Allied strategic bombing campaign that was crippling the German war effort was also systematically annihilating its transportation network. Railways, bridges, and marshalling yards were being pounded into ruin, and as the German logistical system disintegrated, the fragile lifeline that had sustained the prisoners for years was severed. The Red Cross trains stopped running. The physical consequences were immediate and catastrophic. The diaries of men like Staff Sergeant John L. Vietor, an American airman, are a grim record of this rapid decline. His entries from the autumn of 1944 are filled with descriptions of camp life, trade, and speculation about going home. By February 1945, the tone has changed to a desperate chronicle of starvation. "The hunger is a physical pain now," Vietor wrote. "It is a constant, gnawing ache that never leaves, day or night." Without the 4,500 calories from the weekly parcel, the men were thrown back onto the meagre German ration, which itself was dwindling as the Reich collapsed. Vietor documents his and his comrades' shocking weight loss, men losing 30, 40, even 50 pounds in a matter of weeks. The barracks, once filled with the energy of fit young soldiers, became quiet and listless. Sickness spread rapidly. Men grew too weak to get out of their bunks. The hunger winter, as it came to be known, stripped away their physical reserves, leaving them gaunt, weak, and vulnerable. The relative comfort and health they had taken for granted were exposed as a thin veneer, entirely dependent on a supply line that no longer existed. Just as devastating was the collapse of the camp's social fabric, as Lieutenant General Albert P. Clark observed from his position as a senior officer. The cessation of the parcels caused the complex society the prisoners had built to evaporate overnight. The cigarette economy, the vibrant engine of camp life, vanished in a puff of smoke. There was no currency because there was no income. The bustling marketplace, the exchange and mart boards, the entrepreneurs all disappeared. They were replaced by a primitive and desperate struggle for survival. Hoarding became rampant. Men who had a small stash of food from a previous parcel guarded it jealously. Suspicion and mistrust replaced the camaraderie that had once defined their community. Clark described the immense difficulty of maintaining military discipline under these conditions. "It is one thing to command soldiers," he wrote. "It is another thing entirely to command starving men." Fights broke out over scraps of bread. The social order, so carefully constructed, devolved into a state of near anarchy, held together only by the thinnest threads of military authority. The parcel, it turned out, had not just been the foundation of their economy, but the foundation of their civilized society. The logistical data from this period confirms the prisoners' grim experience. The Allied air forces had made the destruction of the German railway system a top priority. By early 1945, official Allied reports stated that over 70% of Germany's rolling stock had been destroyed or damaged, and key rail hubs were rendered inoperable. The International Committee of the Red Cross in Geneva, in its post-war reports, documented a near-total cessation of parcel shipments to camps inside Germany between December 1944 and April 1945. The caloric impact on the prisoners was a simple, brutal equation. In September 1944, a typical POW's daily intake consisted of the German ration, perhaps 1,000 to 1,200 calories, plus the dividend from his weekly Red Cross parcel, averaging around 650 calories per day, for a total of roughly 1,800 to 2,400 calories, enough to maintain health. By February 1945, the parcel was gone. The German ration itself had often been cut to as low as 800 or 900 calories per day. This was not just hunger, it was a state of active, medically defined starvation, imposed not by a deliberate change in German policy, but by the chaos of a collapsing nation. This final, terrible winter offered the most powerful and irrefutable proof of the Red Cross parcel's true significance. Its value was never more apparent than in its absence. The period of relative health, the complex economy, the vibrant social life, the elaborate escape plans, all of it had been built upon the foundation of that steady, reliable lifeline. When that pillar was removed, the entire structure came crashing down. The parcel had never been a luxury. It had not been a mere supplement or a morale booster. It was the fundamental difference between a life of hardship and a slow death. The hunger winter was a brutal, definitive lesson that for the Allied prisoner of war, the simple cardboard box from home was, and always had been, the very architecture of survival. In the first bitter months of 1945, as the Soviet war machine ground relentlessly towards Berlin, a new and final horror began for the Allied prisoners of war. The SS, determined that no prisoners should be liberated by the Red Army, issued orders to evacuate the camps in the east. And so, in the dead of a brutal German winter, tens of thousands of men, already critically weakened by the hunger winter, were forced out of their barracks and onto the roads. These were not orderly transfers, they were death marches. Clad in whatever rags they possessed, with ill-fitting shoes, the men were marched westward with no clear destination. They trudged through blizzards, slept in open fields or frozen barns, and were given almost no food. The German guards, themselves demoralized and desperate, drove the columns onward with casual brutality. The dream of liberation had turned into a waking nightmare. Major General Delmar T. Spivey, the senior American officer from Stalag Luft III, was one of the thousands forced on this terrible journey. His post-war testimony paints a harrowing picture of the ordeal. On the night of January 27, 1945, the prisoners were given a few hours' notice to gather their belongings and prepare to march. What followed was a week-long trek through snow and ice, a brutal test of human endurance. We saw men who had survived years of captivity simply give up, Spivey recalled. They would lie down in the snow, unable to go another step, and we had to leave them behind. The physical toll was immense, but the psychological cruelty was perhaps worse. After years of hoping and waiting for the end of the war, To be marched away from the advancing liberators and into an unknown fate was a final, crushing blow to their morale. For many, it was the moment they finally lost hope. The tragedy was profound. Men who had survived being shot down, who had endured years of privation and psychological warfare, perished from exposure and exhaustion in the final weeks of the war. When the spearheads of General George S. Patton's Third Army finally broke through and began overrunning the camps in Bavaria, the GIs were confronted with a sight that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. At vast camps like Stalag the 7A in Moosburg, which had become a chaotic collection point for prisoners from dozens of evacuated stalags, the liberators found not the defiant, healthy soldiers they expected, but a mass of skeletal, ghost-like figures. A soldier with the 14th Armored Division described the scene in a letter home. These men were not soldiers anymore, they were spectres. Their eyes were hollow, their skin was stretched over their bones. Many of them just stared, unable to comprehend that we were there. We had seen combat, we had seen death, but none of us were prepared for this. The liberators' revulsion at the prisoners' condition was mixed with a burning anger at the enemy and an overwhelming sense of urgency to provide aid. The first priority was food, to begin the long, slow process of nursing these broken men back to health. And here, in the war's final days, the Red Cross Parcel played its last, and perhaps most symbolic role. As Allied armies advanced across France and into Germany, they overran massive logistical depots. In cities like Reims, quartermaster units discovered vast warehouses stacked to the ceiling with hundreds of thousands of American and British Red Cross parcels. This was the lifeline that had been cut during the hunger winter, the tons of food that had been blocked from delivery by the collapsed German transport system. With the prisoners now liberated but starving, a massive, ad hoc relief effort swung into action. Allied quartermaster units, including elements of the famed Red Ball Express, were ordered to drop their military supply missions, commandeer every available truck, load them with the parcels, and race them to the newly freed camps. Before the Army's field kitchens could even be set up, these trucks, emblazoned with the white star of the US Army, roared into the camps, their cargo holds filled with the familiar, life-saving cardboard boxes. The symbolism of this final act was profound and deeply moving for the men who had endured so much. For thousands of liberated prisoners, weak and dizzy with starvation, their first contact with the free world was the sight of a GI handing them a Red Cross parcel. Their first meal of freedom was not from an army mess kit, but from the familiar tins of Spam and Klim and the sweet comfort of a Hershey bar. The very same box that had been their most tangible link to home throughout their long ordeal, the symbol of a promise that they were not forgotten, now became the first taste of that home upon their return to it. It was the perfect, poignant bookend to their story of survival. The journey that had begun with the loss of everything and had been sustained by a simple box now ended with the return of everything, delivered in that same iconic package. Years after the war, in the bright, clean aisles of an American grocery store, a former prisoner of war might find himself pausing, his hand hovering over a can of Spam. To his family, it was a simple, perhaps even humble food item. But to him, it was a relic, a ghost from another life. The sight and feel of it would not trigger a memory of hunger, but a far more complex and profound recollection. He would remember not what it tasted like, but what it meant. In that quiet, brightly lit aisle, surrounded by an unimaginable abundance, he would be transported back to a world of barbed wire and deprivation. The Red Cross Parcel was a lifeline that saved his body, but its true legacy was the indelible mark it left on his soul, a complex inheritance of gratitude, ingenuity, and a deep understanding of what it means to be remembered. The war ended, the hunger passed, but the psychological importance of that simple cardboard box would endure for a lifetime. This enduring legacy was, first and foremost, a debt of gratitude. In post-war interviews and memoirs, survivors like Richard A. Peterson spoke less of the food itself and more of the people behind it. You had to wonder about the women in Philadelphia or Chicago who packed these boxes, Peterson reflected. They didn't know us. We were just names on a list. And yet, they packed every box with such care, knowing it was going to a man who had nothing. This was the parcel's most potent psychological effect. It was a message from the civilian world, a tangible connection to millions of ordinary people who were thinking of them, working for them. It was a profound act of compassion delivered into an environment of institutionalized cruelty. The men knew that the parcels were not a government handout. They were a gift from the Red Cross, an organization powered by volunteers and private donations. This knowledge fostered a deep and abiding sense of gratitude that transcended mere appreciation for the food. It was an emotional bond with the unseen army of civilians who had refused to let them be forgotten. Beyond the emotional impact, the parcel was the catalyst for an extraordinary social and economic experiment, one that served as a powerful form of mental resistance. The analysis by economists like R.A. Radford revealed that the camps had become living laboratories of human ingenuity. The spontaneous creation of a complex market economy based on the cigarette standard was not just a way to distribute goods. It was a way to keep the mind alive. It forced men to think, to calculate, to plan, to negotiate. In a world designed to crush individuality and impose a monotonous, controlled existence, the marketplace was a space of freedom and agency. It was a daily exercise in the principles of a free society, a constant, cognitive rebellion against the totalitarian environment. The intellectual energy required to run this society, to track prices, to create credit systems, to engage in entrepreneurship, was a powerful antidote to the despair and lethargy that was the prisoner's greatest enemy. The parcel, by providing the raw materials for this system, fueled a war of the mind that was as important as any escape attempt. And so, we return to the central thesis established in The Shock of Capture. The Red Cross Parcel was, indeed, far more than charity. It was a standardized, mass-produced weapon against despair. Every can of coffee that fueled a late-night forgery session, every tin of milk that gave a tunnel digger the strength to continue, was a blow struck against the German war effort. It was a tool of economic warfare within the camps. The creation of a vibrant, independent Allied economy, funded by the contents of the parcels, was something the Germans could not control and did not fully comprehend. It allowed the prisoners to bribe guards, acquire intelligence, and finance the vast logistical undertaking of the Great Escape. And most importantly, it was the most tangible proof a forgotten man could hold that the world beyond the wire had not forgotten him. The stark, horrifying contrast with the fate of Soviet prisoners provided the ultimate, tragic proof of this concept. The parcel was the physical manifestation of their status as human beings under the protection of international law, a status cruelly denied to the millions who starved on the other side of an ideological divide. Ultimately, the 10-pound box was a projection of a society's values into the darkest corners of the war. Its improbable journey across a world in flames was a testament to the belief that the life of a single, captured soldier was worth an immense industrial, logistical, and diplomatic effort. It was a message that transcended its humble contents. It said that compassion could penetrate barbed wire, that ingenuity could flourish in the most barren soil, and that a promise made to a man in uniform would be kept, no matter the cost. For the men who survived, it was the physical embodiment of hope, a promise delivered, and the enduring symbol of a world that had, against all odds, reached out and pulled them back from the void.